Hello everybody, my name's Katie and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Libraries FrankTALK with Sandie Docker. Thank you, Sandie, for joining. Now, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which Frankston City Library operates, the Bunurong people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sandie is the author of 3 novels. The latest is the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, which I've just finished reading actually. And if you have any questions for Sandie, just write them into the chat box and you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions when we have a moment. So please make Sandie welcome, and I'll just spotlight Sandie now so that you can all see her front and centre. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Thank you so much for having me down there in Frankston. It's almost a coming home for me. I was just talking with the girls then that I actually spent the first 6 years of my life in Frankston before my family moved to the north coast of New South Wales in Coffs Harbour. So yeah, this feels a little bit like coming home, which is really nice. What we might do today is I'll start off with what I would normally do at a library talk, talk about a little bit about my journey to publication, and then we'll talk about Banksia Bay Beach Shack, and then we can open it up to questions, which I believe Katie is going to facilitate. It's a bit of a strange way to be doing author talks in this current situation like this, but at least we get to connect in some way. And maybe once this coronavirus has passed, we might be able to connect for real in person, which would be nice. I'll head down south and come and see you all. So my journey to publication has been a long one. I was just telling Marnie then how long it has been. It's been about 18 years to get to this point. And unlike a lot of authors that I've met over the last few years, and I go to a lot of author talks, it's my happy place to be. You know, and most of those authors have a story that makes it feel like it's preordained that they would one day be published. You know, they wrote their first book when they were 7 years old, or they came out of the womb reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, and it was, you know, it was destiny that they would one day be a writer. For me, that's absolutely not the case, and it's sacrilegious to admit this, and I know my publicist is on this call, so I'm not sure I should admit it, but I will. And that is that I hated reading as a child. I just saw your face, Katie. I absolutely hated reading as a child. It just wasn't on my radar of things to do. I was the kid that always wanted to be outside, and possibly what contributed to my dislike of reading was the fact that my older sister loved reading. She read everything you're supposed to read when you're a young person, The Famous Five and The Secret Seven and Flowers in the Attic and all of those things. Sweet Valley High, I remember her reading. And whatever she loved, I hated, just by natural course of us being siblings. And, you know, even to this day, I think we still operate under that situation where whatever she likes, I hate. So as a kid, I just didn't enjoy reading at all. But apart from my sister being a massive reader, my father, who is my connection with Frankston, was a massive reader, and he would read every genre possible, probably with the exception of ripping romance. Everything else he would read, and he loved it. And when I was about 16 years old, he handed me a copy of Pawn of Prophecy from David Eddings, who was a mad fantasy writer. And he said, Sandie, just give it a go. Just try it. And of course, I worshipped the ground that my father walked on. And so I wanted to please him. So I took this book rather reluctantly with a typical teenage roll of the eyes and said, all right, that'll go. And I was about 3 chapters into this book, and I knew my life was never, ever going to be the same again. It was a moment where I realised that a book could transport you, mind, body and soul, to another place, another time, and that the characters within the book could actually become friends of yours. And 30 years later, I can actually very vividly conjure some scenes from that book that I read when I was 16, very, very clearly. And that was where I first fell in love with reading. And I would, every fantasy novel I could get my hands on, and I kept asking Dad for more. And I sort of drowned myself in fantasy novels. And then when I hit year 12, the HSC, the equivalent of your VCE, I was in the top English class, because even though I wasn't much of a reader back then, I could write a really good essay. And so I ended up in the top English class. And I was being taught, ironically enough, by a Mrs. Austen. And as part of our extension work, she introduced me to the works of a slightly more famous Miss Austen. And that was my pathway then into women's fiction. So I studied Jane Austen for the HSC, and I fell in love with women's fiction. And then I moved on to Maeve Binchy, the brilliant Irish women's fiction author, and that was my pathway, and that was where I found my reading home and where I've stayed ever since. So my beginnings weren't typical of an author. And then I studied at university, and I was studying Mandarin and German through a Bachelor of Arts degree. And we were doing a translation component as part of the Mandarin course. And I don't know if anyone here speaks another language, but if you do, you'll know that it's very rare you can translate something word for word, particularly if you're talking about a piece of fiction. And we were tasked with an assignment where we had to translate what are the equivalent in Chinese of Aesop's fables into English. And I got my assignment back from my Mandarin lecturer, and she said to me, Sandy, have you ever thought about being a writer? I think you might have a knack. And of course I thought she was crazy, because, you know, this is me who, you know, didn't even read as a child, and the only writing I had done up until that point was some, you know, pretty awful teenage angst poetry when your first boyfriend breaks your heart. That was the only experience that I had. So I thought she was nuts, and I ignored her and continued on with my life. And when my then husband, now husband, then boyfriend, and I moved to London, as a lot of young Australians do, that was when I first thought, I wonder if she's right. I wonder if I could write something. And I think I was very homesick at the time. I'd gone from Coffs Harbour, which at the time was 25,000 people, to my university degree in Newcastle, which, while it is a city, it's very much a small town in terms of its behaviour and its mentality. And then I was living in London, which is very much not a small town. And I was missing home terribly. So I let Lee Shah's words play in the back of my mind about maybe being a writer, and I started writing some stuff down. And that stuff turned into a paragraph, and that turned into a page, and then it turned into 90,000 words of a story. And of course, being young, I think I was about 25, 26 at the time, I did what a lot of beginner writers do when they first start. And I took the adage, write what you know, just a little bit too literally. And I basically wrote my life story at the age of 26 and turned it into a novel. And of course, I thought it was brilliant, because why wouldn't it be? It was about me. So of course it was fantastic. And I started sending it out to agents in London. This is sort of 2000 we're talking now. And I sent it out there to agents, and I expected them to fall over themselves to offer me a publishing contract. And this was the days before email was a big thing. So it was a traditional, you know, big yellow manila envelope that you'd send with your cover letter, just like you would for a job, your synopsis, and your sample 3 chapters. And I sent those out and then waited for all the offers to come back in. And the first envelope came back to me with no letter, no with comp slip, nothing, just my sample pages returned. Yes, Katie, I pulled a face very similar to that. And then the next one came back, same thing, just my sample pages. And the next one, and it was about 5 submissions that came back to me with just my sample pages returned. And I thought it was time to step back and have a look at this, because this, you know, surely this wasn't right. So I took a step back and had a look, and I realised what the problem was. And the problem was that my story all about me was not as fantastic as I thought it was. And in fact, it was less than fantastic, it was awful. I mean, so god awful that the pages should be burnt, then buried, and then the earth salted. That's how bad my first manuscript was. And it did two really important things for me, though. It helped me realise that I could write 90,000 coherent words of a story. And it also taught me that I loved the process of writing. So I put that manuscript away, and it will never, ever see the light of day. As I said, it's buried under the earth and salted. And then I started my next manuscript. And that one was definitely not about me. It had nothing to do with me. So that was a good start to begin with. And I completed that one. And by that time, we had moved back to Australia. So I had my second completed manuscript behind me. And I started sending it out into the world to agents and publishers. And I got the mandatory rejections that all writers seem to get. There were a lot of those rejections, but there were also some nearly yeses in there where the agent or the publisher had asked to see the entire manuscript, and that's usually a good sign that they're quite interested. But even those were at the end turning into no's. So I was getting basic rejections, then I was getting nearly there, and then I was getting rejected again. And this went on for quite some time. And I knew that I had to keep writing to distract myself from all of those rejections. So I wrote what was my third full-length manuscript. And I started sending that out into the world. And we're talking now probably about 2011 by this stage. So we're already 11 years into my publishing journey, and nothing has happened yet. And I had these two completed manuscripts, and I was still getting those nearly yeses, but I wasn't getting over the line. And that was at the time my daughter started school. So I was in a position where I was able to start doing some writing courses and really taking my writing seriously. And that's what I decided that I would do, because I, by that stage, was totally in love with the process, and there was nothing else I wanted to do with my life. There was no plan B, so I had to make it happen. So I started doing some writing courses and getting out there and networking with other writers, with publishing people. And it was a really great way for me to get connected into that world. And then it was in 2016, so with another 5 years there. So we're talking about 16 years now into the journey. 2016, I did a course at the New South Wales Writers Centre with Diane Blacklock, who is an Australian author of women's fiction. And we were doing a course with her, and we connected with her. There's a group of us that are still in contact with her now. And I kind of sunk my talons into her and said, "You're going to be my mentor." Whether she liked it or not, I made her be my mentor. And she, I think, happily agreed to do so. And she took me under her wings. And it was actually a connection of hers that ended up having my manuscript in front of a publisher at Penguin in 2017. And I had a meeting with Penguin in 2017 about this manuscript. She asked to see my other one. So this was manuscripts 2 and 3 that she looked at. And then about a month after that, she sent me the yes email finally. So after what was probably a total of around 200 rejections, I finally got my yes, and they signed me for a 2-book deal, which would turn into the Kookaburra Creek Cafe and the cottage at Rosella Cove. And then Kookaburra Creek got picked up in Germany this year and was released over there. And this year, the Banksia Bay Beach Shack was released in March. And it's been a bit of an interesting ride with this one, because it came out and hit the shelves the exact week that everything started to get cancelled because of COVID. So it's been a strange one. I haven't been able to have a proper launch. I haven't been able to do the normal library talks that we do. But it's okay. It's getting out there, and we're finding other ways like this to connect with our readers. And the Banksia Bay Beach Shack is making its way through the world now, which is a nice little segue into me telling you a little bit about the story, I guess, of the Banksia Bay Beach Shack. After her grandmother Lillian's funeral, Laura, our protagonist, finds a broken pendant and an old photo with an inscription on the back, taken at the beach. And the inscription says, "Lily and Gigi, Sisters of Summer, Banksia Bay, 1961. And there are two things that Laura absolutely has always known about the woman who raised her, and they are that she hated the beach and she never had a sister. So Laura travels to the sleepy beachside town of Banksia Bay to try to uncover the secrets of the past. And amongst the eclectic group of locals is the owner of the beach shack, Virginia, who Laura suspects holds the key to unlocking the secrets of Lillian's past. What Laura uncovers is a story of two unlikely friends, Lily and Gigi, and a series of devastating events that not only change the lives of those two young women, but of the lives of those around them and into the generations to come. And as Laura pieces together the fragments of that summer 60 years ago, Virginia has to choose whether to hold on to her secrets or set them free, and Laura has to decide just how high a price she's willing to pay to reveal the truth. It's a story of first love and last chances, and of the truths and the lies that can impact people across time. So that's the story in a nutshell. And it was an absolute joy to write this one. It was a very different process, however, to writing the Kookaburra Creek Cafe and the Cottage at Rosella Cove. As you now know, those two were already completed and had been completed for a number of years before I got picked up by Penguin. And they took me 3 years and 5 years, respectively, to write. And that's not solid writing for that entire 5-year period. That's me coming in and writing, really hard for a week or two, and then stepping off for a month, and then coming back and having another go, and faffing around and playing with things. So it wasn't solid writing, but it did take that long to write those first two. When I pitched the story idea for the Banksia Bay Beach Shack to Penguin, and they accepted it for publication, I had 5 months to write the story. So I'd gone from faffing around for 3 and 5 years writing the other two to 5 months to write Banksia Bay Beach Shack. So it was a very different writing experience for me. One of the challenges was, if you've read any of my bios, I like to write pen to paper. I like to write by hand. I couldn't do that with a 5-month deadline. There was no way I had the chance to do that. So that was a very different thing for me. And I think there are a few writers here on the call today, and you may be familiar with the terms plotters and pantsers. A plotter being somebody who meticulously plans out their novel from beginning to end, and a pantser is somebody who flies by the seat of their pants with no plan whatsoever. And that's me. So doing a book in 5 months when you have no plan whatsoever of how it's going to go was also a challenge for me. But the upside of it was that instead of wandering off for 2 months and coming back and faffing around on different tangents that were never ever going to work, I found the heart of the story much more quickly. And so that was one advantage to having such a tight deadline to work to. And it came together in the end, and it was actually one of the smoothest editing processes that I've had so far. And as with my other two stories, I have woven together the past and the present. It seems to be something that I just can't get away from. As a writer, it's my natural home to be in when I'm writing a story, to have those two timeline narratives in my book. And in this one, we're going back to the 1960s, which was a fun era for me to research. I was born in the 70s, so I haven't lived through the 1960s. So researching what the music was like back then and what the surf culture was like was also a lot of fun for me. The other thing that was really fun about writing the Banksia Bay Beach Shack was just how close to home this one felt for me. I always write about small Australian towns, and they're always fictional, which gives me a little bit more freedom as an author. I like to have that freedom when I'm creating these towns. But the Banksia Bay Beach Shack has felt the closest to Coffs Harbour to me, which is, as I said before, it's on the north coast of New South Wales. And that's not a surprise, really, that it should feel so much like home, because I was at home when I got the idea for the story. I was home one Christmas with my family, and we were walking along the beach up there, and it had rained the night before. And I don't know if you've ever been to a beach just after rain or just after a storm. The sand keeps the cold in it for such a long time, and it's a really ice cold chill that it has. And we were walking along the sand, and I had this burst of chill that came through my feet, and I had a memory of when I was a teenager and sitting on the sand and feeling that cold seep right through your skin and up into your bones. And then that flash of a memory turned into a scene inside my head of a woman sitting on the sand in the middle of a storm, and she wasn't leaving. And if you've read the book, you'll know that scene within the pages of the Banksia Bay Beach Shack. And so that was where the idea for the Banksia Bay Beach Shack came, just that one scene. And I have to then write, because I don't plan anything, I then write my way to find her story. Who is she? Why is she sitting on the sand in the middle of a storm? Why isn't she leaving the storm? And that was where the story began. And we've covered themes in the book of racism. There's a Greek family that moved into Banksia Bay in the 1960s, and that has ramifications not just on his family, but on his friends as well. Misogyny and what it's like for women in the 1960s. And the 60s is one of those eras, I think, that we look back on now with a lot of nostalgia, and we think it was a beautiful, happy, carefree, wonderful time, and wouldn't it be lovely to go back there? And of course that is all very true, but as with any period in human history, it has its challenges as well. You know, the post-war migration story in Australia wasn't a pretty one. Women, while making strides, certainly at that time, still weren't on an even footing with men. We're probably still not now, we can actually argue. And so it was really interesting to look at the slightly darker side of an era that we today think was just so happy and wonderful. So that was fun for me to delve into that. And of course, the other big theme in the story is about truth and lies, and how they're not always black and white. And for me, growing up, I was one of those really annoyingly righteous people that was absolutely certain there was right and wrong, and there was no in between. And my mum used to always roll her eyes at me and say, "Oh, there's Sandie on her soapbox again," because I was so righteous about the whole thing. I don't know how I had any friends as a kid. I must have been so annoying. But I was always very black and white, and it was only as I got older and lived a little more and got older and had kids and all of those things that happen to you in life when I realised there's an awful lot of shades of grey in the world. Nothing is ever truly black and white. So it was a lot of fun for me to explore that theme within the pages of the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, and you know, what is a truth and what is a lie? When is it okay to tell a lie? You know, righteous teenage Sandie would say never. Adult Sandie would say all the time. And so exploring that was really interesting. And what happens in the story, and I won't give any spoilers, don't worry, is that Virginia tells a lie back in the 1960s, and she carries that with her all of her life. And she told the lie for the best of reasons. Absolutely, it was for all the right reasons to keep that secret, but it still had consequences that affects people today, and that's something you can't know when you decide to keep that secret. So that was a fun little thing for me to play with on the side. I think I've probably talked at you enough, so I might have a sip of water, and Katie, we might throw to questions if that works for you at this point.
Yep, that sounds great, Sandie. Thank you. That was really enjoyable listening to you talk about the book, especially because, as I mentioned before, I've just finished reading it. So I still feel very close to Gigi and Lily, and so it's nice to hear about them again. We have a question from Tony, and she's asking, "Hi, Sandie, what is your writing routine?" So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about when you are on that 5-month deadline. Yep. How do you commit to sitting down and getting it written?
You can probably tell by the expression on my face it's not going to be an easy answer. Hello, Tony. Thank you for your question. I am the least disciplined person I've ever met in my general life. So routine is a slight stretch of the meaning of the word, but there is nothing like a deadline to motivate you. That I can absolutely assure you. I try, and I don't always succeed, but I try very hard to keep my writing hours within school hours. I'm fortunate enough that I am a stay-at-home mum, even though my daughter's now 14, but I do write from home during the day And so I try to keep my writing within those school hours because there's nobody else around to interrupt. When the deadline gets closer and closer, that can turn into some very long nights as well. Just last week, I handed in my next novel to Penguin, and Sophia, please close your ears at this point in time. I pulled some 4 a.m. in the morning stints, working right through until 4 o'clock in the morning to get that deadline met. I think you try to write every day as a writer, particularly if you are on that road to publication, or like me, in the road of publication. But it doesn't always work that way, and you can't beat yourself up if it doesn't happen. You know, there's life that you have to deal with. There's partners, there's families, there's children, there's other jobs perhaps that you're dealing with as well. The more disciplined you are, I think the easier it probably would be. I don't know that because I'm not disciplined. But yeah, so I do try to keep it to within school hours, but I'm not always that successful. What I have found most recently, and I found that when I was writing Banksia Bay because I was on such a tight deadline, keeping a word count was really helpful. And I never did that with the first 2 novels because I was writing by hand, so you can't really keep a word count when you're writing by hand. But with Banksia Bay, I started actually keeping a word count, and that was partly depressing, but also partly motivating when you can see how much you have or haven't got done. And then I would start playing games with myself. Well, yesterday you only got 500 words done. Today, let's go for 1,000, and things like that. And I've learned what I can reasonably achieve in a day, what's a stretch, and what those 4 o'clock in the morning ones look like. So for me, 1,000 words is quite easy. 2 is a good day's work. 3,000 words is a pretty hard day's work. When I was writing the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, I did manage to get up to 5,000 words in a day, and that was a long, hard day. And again, Sophia, please close your ears on this one. I did have one day writing next year's novel, the Wattle Island Book Club, where I managed 10,000 words in a day, and it just about killed me. I would not recommend that, and I don't ever want to have to do it again, but the deadline was looming so quickly that I had no choice. So I don't recommend that. Keep a word count, yes, but maybe aim for like 1,000 to 2,000 words a day if you've got the space to do it.
Thank you. And VB is asking, what is your writing space? What's your writing setup? What does it look like? This is it.
It looks like this.
Amazing.
This is my library. I might, if I can, scooch out of shot for a little bit. There you go. Yeah, so about 2 years ago, just before I got picked up with Penguin, actually, we decided to do a knockdown rebuild. So we were living in a tiny old weatherboard house that was literally falling down around our ears, and I'd been begging my husband for years and years and years to leave Sydney because I wanted to go back to the country, but he wouldn't go because of his work, blah, blah, blah. And so I kind of almost gave him an ultimatum as such. And I said, right, well, if we're not leaving Sydney, I want a new house. So I did that, and I got my new house. And so we built this new house. And one of the stipulations when we were building this house was that I got a library as part of the deal. And so I have this room now that, which is essentially just a room in the house. And I've decked it out in IKEA shelving all the way around. And I have a big desk and a big window. And this is where I do most of my writing, but I do also go to cafes like a real writer does, because I find changing your scenery can switch things up in your brain a little bit. So particularly if I'm stuck and I'm not finding I'm getting anywhere with my writing, I will shut things down, leave the house and get out to write. But, I'll write anywhere, particularly when there's a deadline looming. If I'm at at my daughter's clarinet lessons, I'll take the writing with me and, write a few hundred words while she's having her clarinet lessons. But yeah, this is my beautiful, beautiful space. And I'll even come in here sometimes and just sit, even if I'm not writing, because I'm surrounded by all these beautiful books, and it just feels like a really nice place to be.
Perfect. And you did mention that Maeve Binchy was somebody that helped sort of shape your path. What other authors have you got on your shelves there, or what other authors are an influence on your writing?
Yeah, well, I've got everybody on here. So behind the banner is all of the fantasy novels that I mentioned earlier. David Eddings, Raymond E. Feist, Sarah Douglas, Terry Goodkind, those kind of guys. Game of Thrones is there as well. In front of me, I've got the travel guides and a few of my husband's sort of spy thrillers. I don't read those, he reads those. Over on this side, it's mostly women's fiction and historical fiction. That's what I tend to read the most. Maeve Binchy was, as we've said, my pathway into women's fiction. Jojo Moyes, I love. I haven't read her newest one, and I know that's a bit of a departure from her earlier work, so I'll be interested. It's here on my shelf.
Oh, you'll love it. It's beautiful. I've just read it as well. It's gorgeous.
I've heard such good things about it, so I'm looking forward to that one. Monica McInerney, Josephine Moon. And then I've also got a lot of other Australian writers like Cassie Hamer, Petronella McGovern, who are all actually now friends of mine as well. And the other one, the biggest one in historical fiction for me is Geraldine Brooks. I have all of her novels, and I think she is amazing. That the talent that woman has just completely blows my mind, completely.
Amazing. And so we've got another question here about, can you give us a little sneaky insight into your next novel, or even perhaps just tell us, you said you like exploring different eras. Is this one going to have a different era? And
yeah, it does. I can give you a small sneaky peek. It's while I had to hand it in because the deadline came and went, it's not fully formed yet. It needs a lot of editing work, but that's okay. The basic storyline is there. It's called the Wattle Island Book Club. So it's about a book club, funnily enough, on a tiny island called Wattle Island. And our librarian, it's about a librarian, she's going through some stuff in her life, and she decides to retreat to Wattle Island, who she's been sending the books to all of this time. And it's about her finding her way, the people she meets on the island finding their way. There's a very sexy single dad there on the island who she meets, and he's got a bit of a tragic past that we need to sort out. And the historical part of the story that we move into there is actually the 1950s. So that was a new era again for me that I had to research. And it's, of course, again with me, multiple timelines and multiple points of view as well. At the moment, and this may change in editing, but at the moment it's told from three women's points of view: the librarian, our sexy single dad's grandmother's point of view, and our sexy single dad's wife's point of view. So but I can't give you any more than that because it's in a bit of a mess at the moment. So
we look forward. Marnie and I just had mirror image faces hearing from the ex-wife.
Ooh.
That's amazing. That sounds fantastic. We'll have to look out. So the Wattle Island Book Club, when do you expect to see that one? When can we get our hands on that one, do you think?
Yeah, it should be this time next year. So
That's
around
awesome.
March next year. We're in May already, aren't we? Sorry. So Banksia Bay came out in March. Wattle Island will come out around then. They may have to play with scheduling a little bit because a couple of authors that were due to come out over the next few months have had to be bumped because of COVID, and that may have a knock-on effect, but it'll be around this time next year.
Yes. And Sandie, just going back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk around write what you know, and I know in the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, you've got, they're not siblings, but they're summer sisters. How much of your sister and you did you put into those characters of Gigi and Lily?
She's never.
And you did say they were unlikely friends, so.
Not consciously, but now that you mention it, there is probably a lot of us in there. We are physically polar opposites, my sister and I. She's skinny and blonde, and I'm large and brunette, and Gigi and Lily are physically opposite as well. And we have very different taste in life and men and all of those things, just like Lily and Gigi. You've actually given me an epiphany here, Katie. Boy. And very different philosophies on life as well. So subconsciously, I think there's probably not so much of us as individuals, but us as being chalk and cheese, but still having a close relationship. So my sister and I, while we are completely opposite, and she would agree with you on that one, she's very proud of the fact she's nothing like me, we are still very, very close. You know, there are subjects we can't talk about, of course, as siblings, because it'll blow up and there's just no point going there. But when my daughter was diagnosed with a life-threatening medical condition a few years ago, she was the one that was there for me, even though we'd been estranged actually for a little while before that. And if you read the acknowledgements in my books, I'm one of those people that always reads the acknowledgements of every book that I read. Her name is Karen, and she is always mentioned in there as my biggest supporter. So yes, there's probably actually more of us in Lily and Gigi than I realised.
It's funny what can come out when you're writing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, we do have another question here that if you had your time over, how would you approach your publishing career differently? Then as a follow-up, what advice do you have for up-and-coming authors?
How would I approach things differently? That's a really hard question to answer, because obviously when you go through the journey, you learn a lot. You learn a lot about how the industry works. You learn a lot about yourself as a writer. And so it would be very easy to go back and say, well, I would have changed this and I would have done that differently. But if I did go back and change things, then I wouldn't have learnt those lessons. And if I had, for example, been picked up when I wrote that terrible, terrible, terrible manuscript when I was 26, I wouldn't be able to write the stories that I'm writing now, because I didn't have that life experience that I have now. So I don't know if I would change anything. A few less rejections maybe would be nice, but then they're character building as well, aren't they? And it's when you're facing those rejections when you realise whether you're a writer or not. So it was about a month before I got called in for my meeting with Penguin, where I was at the lowest point in that rejection journey that I had been on, and I was wishing that I could give up, because it would have been the easiest thing to do. It would have certainly been the same thing to do, rather than having your heart ripped out every time you get a rejection. And I wanted to give up, and I knew I couldn't, because there was nothing else that I wanted to do. And I was actually really angry at myself for not being able to give up. And that was at the point where I realised, well, then you're a writer, because it's in your blood. You have to do it. Whether you ever get published or not, you have to do it. So I don't know if I would change the journey at all, but I would maybe tell my younger self to ride through it. You're going to get those rejections. Keep going and don't give up. That would be the thing that I would probably change. Just giving myself a bit more strength to ride through those rejections. And I'm sorry, Katie, I can't remember the second part of the question.
The second part, well, that leads nicely into the second part, which is what advice would you have for up-and-coming authors? So aside from every rejection being a step closer to your being published,
Yep.
then what else would you tell people?
Yeah, the not giving up is a big one. You know, as with most things in life, it's 1 part talent, 9 parts perseverance, and publishing couldn't be any truer than that. You know, there are certainly people that write far better than I do in terms of the beautiful prose and beautiful stories, but they give up, and so they never get published. And so never giving up would be one of the biggest pieces of advice that I could give, and ride through those rejections, because they're going to come. They're going to come. There are very, very few authors in the world that haven't been rejected at some point. And even those who maybe weren't rejected at the beginning of their career, and I know authors that got picked up with their first ever manuscript, you know, by book 3 or 4, they then got dropped by their publisher. So rejection's going to happen as part of your career. So you need to understand that and deal with it. The other thing that I think is really important is write. I can't stress it. I know that sounds really silly to say to writers, if you want to be a writer, you have to write. But you would be amazed the amount of people I've met when I've been doing courses or when I've been doing talks now as a published author that tell me they want to be a writer and they've never written. You know, you can't be a writer if you don't write. And I have friends, dear friends, who did the course with me that I did with Diane Blacklock, which was my stepping stone into publication, that are at that same point that we were in 2016, 4 years ago, with no more words written on the page. And they look at me and they go, oh, you're so lucky. Oh, you've been published. And I'm like, right, you have to write. I think a lot of people are in love with the idea of being a writer without realising how much hard work actually goes into it. And so the only way to get published in fiction, non-fiction is a different story altogether, but in fiction, the only way to get published is with a finished manuscript. So write, write, write. And as with anything in life, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So.
Excellent. I love that advice. You can't be a writer unless you actually write.
And it sounds so silly, but you would be surprised. You would be surprised.
Our next question is from Laurie, and Laurie asks, your titles appear to have a theme. Is this on purpose?
It is, but not by my design. One of the things that happens quite often in fiction writing is a publisher will make the call on the title of a book. So the Kookaburra Creek Cafe and the Cottage at Rosella Cove had very, very different titles when I was writing them and submitting them to agents and publishers. And then when I had my first meeting with Penguin, and I went in and I wasn't under contract. This was that pre-contract meeting that you have with the publisher. And I sat down with Kimberly and she was like, I really love your stories. And her heart starts racing and she starts telling me about her love of Harry Potter. I'm like, okay. And then she talks and talks. And then she said, oh, actually, Sandie, I can see your brand now. And I don't know what expression I pulled. Hopefully it was a professional one and not like this. And I was thinking, brand, what is this woman talking about? Brand, I'm a writer, I'm not a brand. And she had a very clear vision and she said, okay, we're going to change that title of these two books. The title is going to be the cover of the book. So she was all about the title being the hero. And you can see in them, it is all about the title of the book. And she was absolutely 100% certain that it was going to be the place name that was in the title and a hint at what else was going on in the story. So the Kookaburra Creek Cafe, the Cottage at Rosella Cove, the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, and then the Wattle Island Book Club. So she changed the names of those first two books, and then for Banksia Bay and Wattle Island, we've deliberately chosen the titles to then tie in with those as well. And I have to say, I think she did an amazing job with her vision of the brand. The covers, I think, are beautiful. The titles are catchy. You know what you're going to get when you pick up these books. So, so if you are a writer, Laurie, I don't know if you are, don't get too attached to any title that you choose for your book, because chances are, and I have heard this time and time and time again, and even from really established writers who have been doing this a lot longer than I have, the publisher will change it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And just on that, with your stories being set in such Australian settings, how do you think that will translate for the story that's been translated into German? Why do you think that Germany is the right market that picked up your book that's about an Australian place?
Yeah, so that was the Kookaburra Creek Cafe that got picked up, and this is the German cover. Oh, I'm getting stuck on my chair here. It's Das kleine Café der großen Träume, which is the little cafe of big dreams, the translation. So that's it there. Germany is massive in women's fiction. Germany and the Netherlands love women's fiction stories. And so that was one of the reasons why it was picked up. The other thing is, if you do like an Amazon Germany Google search for me, and you'll see all the other titles, how they do the people who browsed this also looked at. There are a million titles over there about restaurants and cafes. So they have a real thing about the restaurants and cafes. And I actually was an exchange student to Germany when I was 18 years old, which may have helped when they were pitching it over there. But the one thing that I learned over there is that they really do love Australia, and they love Australian stories over there. You know, I would go to other classes and do talks, and particularly when I was going into the younger classes there, they would always ask about the kangaroos and the koalas and those sorts of things. So there is a fascination within Germany of all things Australian. So I think that's probably why it got picked up.
Thank you. Now, if anyone else has a question, pop it up now in the chat box. I have a question. I'm trying to remember what it was now. Oh, so you were mentioning earlier that there's plotters or there's pantsers, and that you see yourself more as a pantser. So when you choose your themes for your books, how much of it is about expressing an idea and how much of it is about exploring that theme for yourself?
Yeah, I don't know that I pick the themes before I start. In fact, I don't think I have ever done that with any of my stories, because I tend to start from that one point, which is just a simple scene in my head. So for Banksia Bay Beach Shack, it's Laura sitting under the jetty in the storm. For the Kookaburra Creek Cafe, it was Hattie standing in the middle of this rundown old building. For the cottage at Rosella Cove, it was Charlie sitting on the bench outside the beach shack. So I don't go into a book knowing what the themes are going to be. It's only as I write the story that they emerge to me. And then once I realise, okay, this is where we're going with that, that's when I make that conscious effort to stop and think about how I'm going to portray that theme throughout the story. So yeah, so for me, it's not a conscious decision. So it is definitely an exploration as such, because I don't know going in that these are the things that are going to come up. I sometimes have an idea of how the story is going to end, but I usually don't know how I'm going to get there. And the one thing that I do, and I know it sounds crazy to anyone who's not a writer, is I let the characters tell me how they want their story to be told. You know, I may start the story and I think, okay, this is where we're going with Virginia. And then Virginia goes, nah, Sandie, we're going over here. And and if I fight them, that's when I usually get into trouble with my story. So for Wattle Island, for example, the one that's still in a bit of a mess at the moment for next year, there's a character there who, in my head, once I was about halfway in, I decided that he was going to be part of the Vietnam War. And I could not for the life of me make it fit the story, and I was trying to make the Vietnam War part of it, and it just wouldn't happen, and I was getting really angry. And then I went and did the ironing one day, and it's usually when you're doing those mundane chores that, you know, you have those light bulb moments, and I went, he doesn't have to go to Vietnam. In fact, let's make it earlier, and he's not going to war at all. And then his entire story fell into place. So the advantage of being a pantser is that you have that flexibility to listen to your characters and let the story take you and your themes where they want to go, without being so set on a structure that you've pre-decided.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, we might start winding things up now. So Sandie's books are available in ebook or across our RB Digital, Borrow Box and Cloud Library apps, free with your Frankston City Libraries membership. If you're not a member, you can sign up via our website quickly and easily. You can sign up online and get access straight away to the wonderful books. I just listened on RB Digital, and the girls in the office and I agree that the narration was beautiful and it was just a pleasure to listen to. You can also purchase Sandie's books thanks to Robertson's Bookstore. So we'll pop a link to their website when we share this Frank Talk on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. Please join me in thanking Sandie. Thanks, Sandie. Keep an eye. Thank you. Keep an eye on the Frankston City Libraries website for some great Frank Talks that are coming up. And keep safe, look out for each other, and we look forward to seeing you in our libraries when we reopen. Thank you. Thanks again, Sandie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been lovely to chat to you, and hopefully we'll get to do it for real, not in the too distant future.
I really hope so.